and you look at a job description, or you just ask somebody, maybe it's yourself, maybe it's somebody else in your business or someone on your team, indicate that they are burnt out, have them list out the responsibilities that they're doing, and then classify them as an implementer, management task, a strategic task, or a visionary task. And you'll soon start to see that they're spread out over all 4 of those layers. You are going to optimize talent. You're going to get a better return on investment if you can keep one role, one person inside of 2 consecutive layers.
Hello, Profit First entrepreneurs and thought leaders. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Natalie Gingrich. She is the founder of the Ops Authority, where she certifies and mentors women who leverage their natural skill sets of operations and management. And she's driven to help these women earn an income with ease while doing what naturally comes to this. She has scaled dozens of online and small businesses to the 7 to 8 figure mark. She's worked alongside industry icons and developed diverse teams. She's also merged her corporate career with her entrepreneur learnings to create the Director of Operations program, which is a certification program that allows these ops directors to really be able to manage 7 and 8 figure businesses out there. She has a podcast. Her podcast is called The Ops Authority. It's a weekly podcast, so definitely check it out. And today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about scaling your business while optimizing your labor, which, is a very tricky part of business, right? Making sure that if you add certain hires too quickly, it can quickly lead to draining your cash flow. And today, Natalie and I are going to talk about how to scale those operations, particularly the labor part, in a way that allows you to still stay profitable. So please join me in welcoming Natalie Gingrich to the platform. Hey, Natalie, how are you doing today?
Hello. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're excited to have you because I think labor, especially when you're around that 7 and 8 figure mark where, you can no longer do it yourself. You're at that point that you're hiring higher level managers, right? People that have the experience that can lead your team, especially when you're starting to compartmentalize. It can get tricky, right? Because they're typically more expensive positions. You can't really manage everybody anymore. And so you need that. And so this is an exciting topic to talk about. But, before we get started, I always like to get the background. Like, how did you get into this? How did you find this as your passion of an area to be in?
Well, thank you for asking. So like you stated, I kind of grew up in corporate. I spent my first 15 years in corporate America, and that was kind of unexpected. My education and background is actually in nursing and in healthcare. So as a few moves would have it, I ended up, going down a different path, and I worked in corporate, came into corporate really in the healthcare management space. However, I was working inside of a Fortune 150 insurance and financial services company. It's kind of wild, but they had some employee resources internally, and I was managing their clinics, and it was still kind of an awesome opportunity and a really big company. And I was able to come in and get a lot of on-the-job training. So I told you what my background was, but I spent the next 15 years in the areas of human resources and leading big projects and working in our PMO office. And that all led me into being the chief of staff. And that was a combination of all of the greatest skills that I never knew I had. I had these skills my entire life. If I think about, project management, being very detailed and organized, I have memories of myself all the way back to like 8 years old, right? Making a list for myself every single day. That's how I was measuring success and achieving goals and tracking my goals. And that didn't seem important at the time, but those same traits throughout my entire life have really formed me and led me into that executive role of being the chief of staff. And as luck would have it, I had a shift in what my needs were, and my children were growing up, and I needed to do something different to balance home and 2 incomes and very busy children. And I exited the corporate space, and I had no idea, Susanne, that I was going to land here. I knew that I had these great skills. I knew the chief of staff role was super fulfilling. I loved the notoriety. I loved the work that I was doing. I was all in operations, and I loved supporting. So there was a combination of that operational skill set in combination with the relationships I was able to build. And then also just, truly being a servant-hearted person, it fit me so well. So insert, life change, and I quote unquote come home to figure out how to do life differently, to be more balanced, to be able to live a legacy life, which was really my motivator at the time. And my very first company I started, and it was more of a life and business coaching business. And over time, I was just too solution oriented. I was working with these people and solving I was really looking into their business operations, which then I was really outside of the coaching space. And I went all in on helping businesses to grow by leveraging and optimizing all of their operations. And all of that seems very unsexy, but made such big changes that it really caused me to start a second business called the Ops Authority. And that's what has brought me to this point. I was working with businesses one-to-one and as a consultant coming in and doing this work. And then over time began speaking about it and just becoming an authority myself in operations. And before you knew it, I was just overloaded, and people were wanting me to train their staff so that they could get some of the successes that their peers or the people that were referring them to me were getting. And that led me to building the certification that we have today, the Director of Operations Certification Program.
I love it. Now, our audience, they're profit first entrepreneurs, right? Typically they start, I've seen them at 500,000. I've seen them all the way up to 50 million. And obviously a $500,000 business has very different needs than 8-figure business, a $50 million business. And so let's talk about that evolution, because whether they're 500,000 or they're 50 million, I'll tell you, every one of these entrepreneurs always tell me they feel overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about, how do you start to get that key man, right? Which is what a COO is, really. It's a key man for that position. How do you start to build into that position? Right. We'll start when they're small and we'll gradually go up.
Yes. So I use something called the 4 functional layers of talent. And if you can envision a pyramid as I'm talking through this, but the bottom, the base is obviously the biggest. And I call that layer the implementation layer. So this is the type of talent, the classification of talent that you need when you're first, think back as you're listening to this, think back to that very first hire, or maybe the first dozen hires that you brought in. Most of the time, you as the CEO are delegating small pieces, or maybe a lot of small pieces or tasks to somebody. And they're coming in to alleviate a little bit of time, to give you some bandwidth to focus on more strategic things. And so that initial labor that we bring in is what I call implementers, or implementation focused. And you see your administrators, you see, entry-level talent, but they're not just entry-level. There's still a lot of great talent in that band. The next band up from there, or next layer, is what I term management. So this is where you start to get a little bit more independent thought, maybe even some thought leadership coming in here. And then you get the actual management of talent coming in, which is a big, big weight off of leaders' shoulders. And it's not just people management, though. It's also project management. It's process management. It's just the next higher level thinking. The third band, or the third from the bottom, that next layer and evolution is strategy. And this is where the CEO always wants to be. And I won't limit this to, especially for those of you guys who have, higher 7 and 8-figure businesses. You've got multiple key leaders in your company that are supporting the entire mission. But that's where these, in corporate, you would call these executive leaders. But in that third band, you dream of just staying in strategy and not doing all these other things, right? Of course, that's not always feasible, but that strategic band, that is true thought leadership. And that's where you start having the autonomy. That's where you start to get depth and experience and results oriented. That's the expectation of that layer. The very tip top, which is vision, or being the visionary of, you can call it a company. Sometimes it's a division or a unit. But that's the visionary spot. There's not a lot of room up there, because you shouldn't have more than 1, maybe 2 people in a partnership in that layer. So we start at the bottom, implementation or implementer, then manager, then strategist, and then visionary. Those are the 4 different layers. And when we talk about burnout, I see burnout. And if you use this and you look at a job description, or you just ask somebody, maybe it's yourself, maybe it's somebody else in your business or someone on your team, indicate that they are burnt out, have them list out the responsibilities that they're doing and then classify them as an implementer, management task, a strategic task, or a visionary task. And you'll soon start to see that they're spread out over all 4 of those layers. You are going to optimize talent. You're going to get a better return on investment if you can keep one role, one person inside of 2 consistent or consecutive layers. And the reality of scaling a business, I'm a business owner as well. It's unrealistic for me to hire one person to come in and only do implementation and another person to only do management. So I want to give you the grace and really the key, the magic behind this pyramid and in getting your return on investment is making sure that everybody in the company is over 2 layers at one time until you have the ability to reinvest some profit back into the company and to bring in, more specialists, if you will. But it's not realistic to have 1 or 2 people in each of those layers and know that you want them to carry 2 and to progress up. This is a great tool for helping people to develop. I know that's not what we're talking about today, but the burnout happens when you see one person carrying the weight of all of those different layers. It's unrealistic. And that's where we see a lot of turnover, a lot of attrition, a lot of frustration, decrease of morale. It sounds simple when I explain the pyramid, but it has turned dozens and dozens of businesses around.
Exactly. And some people, they're meant to be implementers. They're not meant to be strategic thinkers, and putting them in that role can be overwhelming for them. So I can definitely see, hire for what your expectations are and making sure that they can fulfill those expectations there.
Yeah, it's a very helpful tool when you're creating a job description. A lot of people come to me for hiring and, they'll come to me and they'll say, Natalie, I'm looking for a, customer client success manager or a project manager or a COO, whatever the title is. But they come to me telling me what they want. And in reality, I'm going to give you a slip here. It really doesn't matter the title. Titles don't represent anything consistently because there's not a final structure out there. The government has kind of nailed that, but the military has nailed that. But most industries, a COO at one company is not the same as a COO at the next company. Even a competitor company can have a really, really different job description, scope, and role. So don't get attached to the title. What I like to do is take the responsibilities that role is going to fulfill. And then I look at them in those 4 different layers I just talked about. And that helps me to understand the scope of the role and what they really should be, what the title should be, what the compensation should be. Obviously, the higher up on that pyramid, the higher the title, the higher the compensation, the more responsibility, the more results oriented you're going to be looking at. But to me, it's been a very, very powerful tool in my consulting efforts.
Definitely. So entrepreneurs out there, beware of the titles that you give, because one, they're going to do that search on Indeed and go, how much should I make if I am this level, right? And if they're really doing the work of entry level or even mid-tier and they're trying to get a chief ops, or a COO type of title, you're going to have a hard time with that pay negotiation if you're trying to retain that talent. So definitely be aware of those titles that you're allocating, as Natalie is suggesting there. So let's talk about operations. Let's talk about optimizing operations. And maybe we can start at, the different levels, right? Natalie, what are some suggestions, first of all, or for optimizing operations, like in terms of that role? Like, what are some things that our entrepreneurs should be looking out to make sure that they do?
First thing is prioritizing the work that you need to get done. So everybody comes in, especially, they come in with the knowledge, the acumen, the will, the dream of having solid goals. And everybody's going to tell you to have those. And I, of course, commend people who take the time to get at the real root of what success looks like for their company. So defining that, creating a success measure for those things. We call those key performance indicators. I'm sure that's not a new word to most of you guys, but that's the measure. And it's one thing to have a goal. It's a whole different ball game when we start to measure it. And from there, we want to understand what makes that up. And that's where a lot of the projects come in. That's where a lot of the visioning happens, where leaders that I partner with will come to me and say, oh, I want to do all of these things. I want to improve what we're doing. I want to add new things. I want a new product line to come in. happen. I want to bring in a whole new team. So now all of those to me, in my mind as an operator, turn into projects. And it is not uncommon for my visionary counterparts to come in and say, okay, I want all of that done in the next 6 months. Doesn't that sound great? While it does sound great, it's not exactly practical, but to optimize your operations, you need that counterpart to come in and say, okay, I understand the goal. I know how we're going to track this to understand what success, if we're reaching, the goals that we want. And then next thing, all of these projects, now I need that operator to help me to prioritize the projects, to make sure that we're going to get a return, to make sure financially that this is the right time to do it, to make sure that we're adequately staffed to make those things happen. So starting from the top down, goals, KPIs, making sure that you have an operator who can help you to fulfill all of these things. And then, someone with a really strong management background to manage not only the people. I think when we think of management, it's like as a leader, we go right to the people. In reality, it's really managing the project, managing the people, making sure that we're creating good structures, finding inefficiencies and gaps, and, inserting that back in. All of that to me, to make this happen, it really comes down to having a strong operational plan. And visionaries, if you're leading these companies, operational plans don't really come to light very easily. What is very natural for a visionary is a strategic plan. This is the big goal I have, and these are the ways I want to achieve that. But how do you make that happen? And to me, that's the difference in strategic planning and an operational planning.
I love that. So what are the traits of the ideal operations? And help me find the word for this. What is the name of this position that we want to hire for at this level, typically called?
So I've got different bands, and they do go hand in hand with the pyramid idea that I was presenting earlier. But in that early stage, in that, what I call the implementer level, we're looking for an assistant. It may be a marketing assistant, maybe an operations assistant, it may be an executive assistant. I mean, there's a lot but the title that is most common there is assistant or coordinator. And as we progress up, it's from the bottom. It is, and this is general, you're going to have to apply it to your business. But what I see on the large part here is an assistant up to a coordinator, to a manager. Then we get into, a director level. And then, from there, we might see a president, a vice president, et cetera. And where you are in your business and the skills that you have as a CEO, which are very different, are going to dictate what you need to bring in. And so, most of us are going to start from the bottom and work up because that's what we can afford. That's financially likely going to be the smartest thing that you can do, unless you have investors, investors can change everything I'm saying, because you can skip those bottom layers and bring in somebody else. But for companies that are building from the bottom up without having large capital and large investments, this is typically the path that you're going to follow.
I love that. So it's starting with the assistant level, really where you're delegating tasks to that's able to follow through and getting those things done. And it's really important from what I'm hearing from you, Natalie, is that when you're hiring an assistant, as you're growing, you're not expecting this assistant to be able to manage people. Because I think, a lot of times people go, oh my gosh, I need an ops manager now. I need someone to be responsible for these projects. And we're looking at this assistant like, why can't you lead? Why can't you provide feedback? Why can't you get these people moving? Because that wasn't their position. They are doers. They are task doers, meaning you give me a task and I finish it up. And so as you're growing, those needs are changing. You're getting someone now that's coordinating multiple parts. Then you're getting a manager. This is an awkward position for a lot of companies, right? Because, sometimes the people that we start with are not the people that are going to end up with us, right? Because we grow out of certain positions. Now, sometimes an assistant's a little bit easier to keep giving them different tasks to do. And maybe they come more of a personal assistant, maybe an executive assistant as they grow up through the company. But sometimes we outgrow that person. We need more of a leader versus a doer. So tell me about how you see these businesses evolve when that happens. Are they letting the assistants go or the coordinators go when they can't rise up to the occasion? When they were hired just to be a coordinator, what happens as you scale?
Yeah, this is a really good conversation. It's always very different from business to business and different structure to different structure. What we tend to advise on is the skill set of, and we'll just use the example of an assistant. That's very common, but someone who comes in with that doer mentality it could just be the age. It could be their experience or their lack thereof, of experience. And as they get acclimated, they learn that really, on the job training inside of your company, they could be developing. And just because they came in without management experience, you may be giving them the opportunity to step into that. So I first will always try to keep somebody, I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys, but it's a lot more cost effective to keep somebody in the business. And so I'll use this ladder, this pyramid approach of if someone comes in here, I know within the next 18 months, it's my job as a leader to develop them into at least those bottom two. So now we're going to stretch them. We're going to give them some test projects, some test responsibilities so I can see if they are capable of managing, and whatever managing means to you. It can be, it can be different role to role and business to business, but I want to test them and see if they have the capability and the skill set to be able to manage. And, sometimes you're going to see that they can, and other times they're not going to. And so then you have to make the, ideally, Susanne, we're going to want people to have ownership of 2 layers. And so if someone comes in is implementer only and they don't have the ability to stretch to a manager, I'm starting to scratch my head and think, am I going to get a return on investment from this person? Or do I need to stack their role more wide instead of deep? And so, that's when, adding more task to that person needs to happen. But as they progress, a lot of people who come in as executive assistants have the ability to be great project managers. They're very task-oriented when they come in, but you see them start to be interested in your business and attached to your mission, and just the investment grows deeper, and they have the skill. They just have never been asked to leverage it. So I can't tell you how many times executive assistants grow into project managers. And then I'd say 20-30% of the time, those people go on to become, live somewhere in that strategic level. Most of the time that comes with time, that comes with experience, it comes with training, and they're able to step into that next layer of strategy. But it really depends on what you have, what skills you need, and what skills you don't have as a leader. A lot of times we're looking for that complement, and operators tend to do that. And another thing I wanted to point out that popped in my head earlier as you were speaking, when you get to that $1 million mark, the level of operator that I see is that director. That's really, truly the reason that we created the Director of Operations Certification Training Program. $1 million to about $25 million is where a director of operations makes the most sense, where you're still going to get your return on investment. Once you get past that 25 million, you're looking at bringing in a COO who has the autonomy and the leadership span of several of those operational areas. And you start to see an organization that's set up functionally and divisionally.
Right. So it's going to be becoming a matter of, as you progress through it, you have to make the decision to put the person in for what you need, but also looking at the budgetary constraints and seeing what you can afford, because you may have to replace a position if they are unable to grow into it, or hire Natalie to train them, or really your options there with that. And even Natalie will probably say sometimes people are just not ready for that level too. Mm-hmm. So it's, really it's about, first of all, trying to train that person into the next level, or making a decision. Otherwise, can you afford to keep both? Is that person giving you the ROI by maintaining them? So very, very good there. So where does it go wrong? I'm curious, where does it go wrong in this ops position? For entrepreneurs?
Yes. This is really, really something I need everyone to hear, because I believe that this is the hardest thing. As someone who's leading a company who is wanting to make sure that we are cost effective, that we're getting that ROI, and also that we get a good productivity from these people. Stacking a role too heavy, big time. Like, we have to get the words out of, or the idea out of our head, or the concept out of our head of having a Jill or a Jack of all trades, like one person who comes in here and does everything, or someone who comes in and carries all 4 of those layers. That never leads to job satisfaction or good morale. Typically results in turnover much faster than you want. So that's one thing. The other is when we have that unicorn concept. Other people have called it a Frankenstein role, where it's just like this, a little of this, a little of that, a little of this, and there's not a lot of purpose to the role. If you take the role and you look at it like a human being, it's really, really hard the more hats or the more plates we are spinning at one time. And so I'm not saying to have a watered down role. I'm saying to have a cohesive role, a role that fits fits the skills and the gifts and the passions of the person that you have chosen to hire. So be very, very aware that there is a front side of business and a back side of business. That front side that I'm talking about here, that I've classified as the front side, are typically your lead generation, your marketing, and your sales units. And then once you get that, all of the things that lead to acquiring the customer, leading to that transaction, once the transaction happens, that's what I call the back office, or the back side of business. And making sure that the person that you've hired doesn't cross those two things. I'm very, very particular about that. They're typically very different people. You can look at it like a right brain person and a left brain person. And just think about your own experiences, when we're stretched to be both of those things, it's really, really difficult. And it puts us in a place of not being able to be our best or not to excel. And so we guide companies to choose, are you hiring someone from the front side or someone from the back side? And even when we're looking at the responsibilities, if the opposite side starts to pop up, I'm like, oops, do you know that you're putting marketing skills over here? And they exhaust people. They're out of their zone. And so their productivity decreases, which is going to affect your return on investment.
Definitely. And I like to tell most entrepreneurs, because I think a lot of times they don't realize this, that most entrepreneurs, especially if you are thriving in your trade, especially if you're in your top 1% of your category, you probably are a unicorn. Yeah, you are able to do your trade. Yeah, you're able to do your marketing and sales, but most people can't handle that. I know there's a lot of talk about A players, and I love A players, just like everybody else loves an A player. You only have to hire 1 versus 5 to do one job. But the reality is, people are A players in particular functions. They're not A players in terms of being CEOs when you're hiring them to be a secretary. And so I think that's an amazing point that you're bringing out, Natalie, is that you can't expect people to do everything, because your assistant, your operations coordinator, they're going to feel like they're failing if they're doing too many things that are outside of their zone of genius.
Yeah. And thinking of the A player concept, have an A player for your marketing team and an A player for your operations. And then you get a very, very high functioning business that does truly allow the CEO to get closer to that visionary role and out of doing the day-to-day management.
I love it. I love it. Very, very strong thoughts on that. Natalie, this has been so amazing spending this time with you and just getting so much of your knowledge and your experience with this. One of the things that I like to ask our guests is, if you could give our audience one piece of advice, it can be business or personal, what would that advice be?
Be very, very clear in your values, your personal values. I don't even care the size of business. This is something I have every employee do here. And I don't care if we're a team of 10 or a team of 100 or a team of 10,000. And something I wish I could have taken back to my corporate days when I was managing hundreds of people and had influence over hundreds of people at a time. Understanding your personal values and how that translates into your work relationships. This is obviously outside of the span of operations, but it affects the dynamics of the team, which are going to affect the productivity of the team and the ability for them to develop and enjoy what they're doing, which is important, should be important to all of us here. But once you understand your values, you are able to identify your boundaries and expectations that you have of yourself. And then the next piece of that is communicating that to your peers, your leaders. And as you develop and hire and bring in people into your company, as a company, you have your values, and then you can attract the people that fit best there. But that's one of the greatest benefits that has come from my work with companies is, understanding your values. And you can expand that to your mission, your vision, and your values. But I think values are the key component to helping you as a leader to keep your guardrails up. And when something new comes in, you can come back to those. When something isn't working inside of your business, or a person is aggravating you that works with you, whether it's a customer, a client, a student, a team member, when you boil down to what is not working, it typically comes back to there's been a rub in your value set. And so it helps us to be such stronger leaders and thought leaders too.
That is amazing advice. And you're right. If you don't know what you stand for, then it's going to be very hard to recognize when things are happening that you're really not happy about, that it's going to keep you up at night and just really make you unhappy in your business. And that's terrible to be unhappy in your own house, right?
Yes, very much.
And so, Natalie, how do our viewers and listeners find you? How do they contact you? How do they work with you?
Yeah, thank you. So definitely head over to the Ops Authority podcast. You can find that on any podcast player, I suppose. If you're listening to this, you're well acquainted with the podcast world. But I share a lot of operational tips for people who are in the operational fields, and business owners. Lots of business owners listen to the podcast and walk away with better training on how they're going to lead their own teams. So the Ops Authority podcast is excellent. Any social channel, you can follow us and keep track of what is happening at the Ops Authority.
Thank you. And what I'll do for you guys, if you're driving right now and unable to stop, but I'm going to put Natalie's information in the show notes so that you can find her podcast and locate her on her social media. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much.